Be careful when you enter Big Sky Country. You might just encounter some big mysteries. Cryptids. It always comes back to the cryptids. Whether Bigfoot, skinwalkers, or other unknown creatures, these entities can strike fear in your heart, or possibly just rip it out, depending on the type of cryptid and its mood. I want to take a moment to thank you, all of my current subscribers, and all of you currently listening, perhaps for the first time. Thank you for joining me for these 5 reportedly true, scary cryptid stories. If you like these terrifying tales and have not done so already, please hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you make sure not to miss a single scare. Now, put your senses on high alert and try not to get too caught up in the video to make sure you can hear that cryptid that may be creeping up on you. Enjoy. Skunk Ape Encounter by wowsuchtitan. So back in November 2017, me and my family made the trip from the UK to Florida as part of the first leg of our 2-week-long final family vacation before we kids moved out and get on with our own lives. We did Disneyland, Universal, all that typical touristy stuff. Not relevant to the story, but whatever. My dad is massively into cryptids and conspiracies and all that jazz, and for the entire time kept driving my mum insane with stories of the skunk ape that is known to frequent the woods of Florida. It just so happens that the holiday estate we were staying at in Kissimmee, Florida, backed right onto one of these. Aside from a few roads, it's pretty much swamp, marsh, and forest for the next 20 to 30 miles. On perhaps the 5th day of our holiday, it was late in the evening and me and my dad were watching TV in the lounge of our villa, whilst my mum and my sister chilled out in the backyard. Suddenly, we started hearing tapping on the glass of the sliding door leading into the garden. It was my sister beckoning for me to come outside. So I get up and investigate, and as soon as I step outside, I'm hit with this strong smell that I can only describe as a very, very musky, wet ferret. I asked my mom and sister, WTF is that smell? And they go on to explain that they were just chilling, enjoying the sound of the crickets and cool evening air, when suddenly they got hit by the strong feeling that something was watching them. They then noticed that the crickets went dead silent. Then the smell that I smelt hit them. This only lasted for about 30 seconds before the feeling subsided and the crickets started chirping again. It was then that my sister started knocking on the glass for me. We relay this to my dad, and suddenly he's like a kid in a candy store telling us it must have been the skunk ape. I only got to smell whatever it was, but after I started talking with my sister about the incident, she said it almost felt like something intelligent was watching them. My mum is still a firm skeptic and says it was probably just an alligator. We had a lot of these chilling at the holiday estate, walking past with something dead in its mouth. But dead things or alligators don't smell like 1,000 extremely smelly wet dogs. Included is a picture of where it happened. The villa itself was being built when the Google satellites did their thing, so it's not there. but I kind of figured out the general area. What do you guys think? Creature Sighting by Strawberry Bean. To start this off, there are 0 bear, moose, or elk where I lived at the time. Background info. At the time I was about 12 or 14, and I was with my friend who I'll call Kayla. We planned on going on a picnic in her pastures. As we walked up a smaller hill, Kayla pushed me to the ground and whispered, "Do you see that?" At least 20 or so feet away was a tall creature. It stood on 4 thin limbs, and its head was narrow, similar to a horse or a deer. It was completely black. I couldn't make out features, but it had a mane like a lion, but it seemed flat and coarse. The mane-like fur ran along its back, stopping near the rear. It had no tail. Here's a side note. All of the cattle were moved to a completely different area, nowhere near this one. No other livestock animals were in those pastures, but this thing was just staring off. Suddenly, my friend stood up and made a beeline for the exit to the pasture that was at least 2 miles away. I didn't hesitate to follow her. We finally stopped near the latched fence that led to her house and looked back. We had a pretty good view of the hill it stood on. It was slowly walking back into the trees. This still gives me chills. Driving El Cerro, Hellhound or Skinwalker by Bones21232. Okay, so Friday, 1:28 a.m., me and my friends decided to go for a drive. We sometimes like to go to the Llano, mountains near El Cerro, to experience something that only happens in that area. Something paranormal and supernatural. Like any other time we do this, we go in my car and drive past Tomé Hill, going towards the mountains, and park across from VHS about 1.5 miles away. Then we sit and take in the scenic beauty of the dark desert. Then, starting by listening close to anything and looking everywhere, we're being hyper observant. At first, we saw a light in the distance traveling flat on the desert land, getting within about 1 mile away from us, then disappearing altogether. Moving on from there, we had to, and I mean had to, see something else. Driving through roads and flying by at least 30 miles per hour over the speed limit, we turned down a familiar road. This is where we knew that something was about to change. Me and everyone else, including me, 4 people in total, looked to the right side of the car. We saw what we all believed to be something like a hellhound or maybe a skinwalker. It was a massive black dog that just launched itself at my car while I was going 45 miles per hour down the road. We should have felt impact from the massive creature, but didn't. Both people in the back seat looked and saw this thing rise up from the ground and stand straight up on 2 legs, absolutely huge, and all black with red eyes that are forever imprinted in our minds. I didn't slow down, but sped up, going about 55 miles per hour now, so probably about 20 yards away. They saw it rise up as if nothing happened to it. The 1892 Bitterroot Mountains sighting. Researched and written by Montana's own Greg Strandberg. One interesting story comes to us from former President Teddy Roosevelt. Our 26th president was quite the accomplished writer, penning 35 books during his lifetime. One of those was 1892's The Wilderness Hunter. The Wilderness Hunter by Teddy Roosevelt referred to a goblin story that quite impressed him. The story had originally been told to Roosevelt by a man named Bauman, a weather-beaten old mountain hunter that had passed all of his life on the frontier. Bauman told a story of he and his trapping partner heading out among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of Wisdom River. They didn't have much luck there and moved through a particularly wild and lonely pass, one with a bad reputation due to the death of a trapper the year before. The man had been slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors. Bauman and his partner knew the tales but went up into the pass anyways, about 4 hours up into it. There, they reached a little open glade and made camp. Since there was a bit of daylight left, the two men headed upstream and looked for beaver to trap. When they got back to camp, it was clear that something had visited their camp and had rummaged about among their things, scattered the items in their packs, and destroyed their lean-to. The men set about restoring their camp, and then, now dark, they took a look at the footprints. They'd figured that a bear had done the destruction, but upon closer examination, something wasn't right. Bauman, the other trapper said, coming back into camp after following the tracks off into the forest a ways, using a single stick from the fire to light his way, "That bear has been walking on 2 legs." The two men checked the tracks, came to the conclusion that something was quite odd, and then turned in for the night. Around midnight, Bauman was awakened by some noise and sat up. He smelled a strong, wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Reaching for his rifle, Bauman managed to get a shot off. Whatever the thing had been went crashing back through the woods. The men slept little the rest of that night, then set about checking their traps the next day. They stayed close together. Upon returning from their work, they found the same ransacked camp as the day before. Again there were footprints. Again, they appeared to be left by something on 2 legs. Roosevelt recounts what happened next. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight, the thing came down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a peculiarly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. The next morning, the men decided to get out of there. They still had to gather their traps, however, so set about doing so. All through the morning, the two had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. There'd be the occasional snap of a twig, the slight rustling of pines, and the dancing shadows that sunlight through the trees can create. The men were on edge, no doubt about it. They headed back to camp for a noon meal and thought things out. There were still 3 traps over yonder on a little pond near a wide ravine. Bauman said he'd head on out and get 'em, leaving his friend to pack up the rest of their belongings. There were 3 beavers awaiting Bauman when he arrived, and being the good trapper he was, he set about cleaning the furs right then and there. It took longer than he thought it would, and by the time he started back, the sun was already beginning to set. Bauman set off back toward camp. He headed through the forest, sunlight reflecting strangely, little breeze about, and the gloomy stillness which always broods over these somber primeval forests. Finally, he reached the edge of camp. He called out, but no call was returned. Bauman began to feel uneasy. He could see the thin blue smoke still curling up from the now out campfire and the wrapped and arranged packs near it. Stepping closer, however, his eye fell upon the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks in the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire, and his back to the dense woods to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long, noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its forepaws, while it buried its teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gambled about it in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bauman grabbed his rifle and got out of there, leaving everything else. He headed back down the pass as fast as he could, thinking something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast, was after him. The horses were still grazing in the meadow, and he got them and got out of there, riding onwards through the night until beyond reach of pursuit. Bigfoot Encounter by Hand of Doom 97. August 5th of 2017, Mammoth, California. My ex-fiancée and I were avid climbers, hikers, and explorers of the East Side Sierra Nevada mountain range, and we decided to go up to Yosemite to climb. Now, Yosemite is stupid crazy to get campsite reservations for, so we decided to stay on BLM land a few miles down the 395 from Mammoth, where we don't have to pay for camping. We pitched our tent and got settled in, made dinner. Then I went to go set up our trash bag about 1,000 feet from camp. I don't like having bears close to my tent. It started to rain a little, so we went into the tent and went to sleep around 20:30. It was probably 01:30 on the 5th. It had stopped raining and I had to take a leak. So I put my flip-flops and headlamp and start walking to the spot where I figured it's far enough away that it wouldn't attract anything. Now, it had just stopped raining, so when it was dead quiet, so I dismissed the silence as everything was hunkered down. So from where I was taking a leak, the trash bag was about 200 yards to my right. As I finish up, I looked to make sure the bag wasn't blown down during the relatively heavy storm that had just finished up, and it wasn't in the tree. So I looked at the ground and saw the biggest black bear I'd ever seen. So I start hollering and screaming, making a lot of noise to scare it off. Then it fucking stood up and looked at me, just covered in hair. Stood about 8 foot, with shoulders as wide as meter stick, then ran off. I said, fuck this, I'm going back to the tent, and sprinted the entire way. I get back in the tent and my fiancée asked me why I was yelling, and I told her I was scaring off a bear from the trash bag. She snuggles back in and falls asleep. I'm wide awake, listening intently for any movement, when I start hearing footsteps around the car where we kept the food, and then the footsteps started coming towards the tent, and got scared thinking that this thing, whatever it was, can just come through the tent if it wanted to. It started touching the tent, and I can hear heavy breathing and grunting. Then my fiance wakes up, freaks out thinking it was a bear, and grabs the keys and hits the panic button on the car, and whatever creature ran off. I didn't encounter anything again that trip, and I played it off to her as if it was a bear and we should probably find somewhere new to camp that next night. On August 5th, we packed up and left early to go climb in Yosemite, and when we came back that night and the new campsite, I approached another camper that I recognized from the previous, and he asked me if I noticed anything weird going on the previous night. I told him the story, and he said that he heard my screaming and car alarm, and both times, shortly after, something went at full lope through his campsite. While going into his vehicle the next morning, he noticed that there were huge handprints on his car's windows and was freaked out enough to move to a new spot as well. He pitched a tent 30 feet from where we were at, and we together for the remainder of the trip. I'm not sure what I saw, but the closest thing I can relate it to was Bigfoot. Thanks again for joining me for 5 scary cryptid stories. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell to know when the latest horror is available. Want to hear your true or fictional scary story narrated by me on this channel? Send your story to bigskymysteries@gmail.com or check the description below for more details. Hear that snap of the branch? Or what about that flash of eyes near the top of the window? Maybe it is just your imagination. Or maybe it's a cryptid stopping by to see what you're doing. I'll see you in your nightmares. Good night.